Welcome everyone from Primary Source. My name is Deborah Cunningham and I will be hosting our webinar this evening on racial injustice in the African American experience. This is a webinar series that Primary Source has been wanting to do for quite some time, and we're glad it came together this winter in a 3-session series really that all are sort of a coherent sequence. In tonight's session, the first in our series, will address the social legacies of slavery, things that have persisted for some 150 years. And race, society, memory, monuments, these will be some of the things that we explore tonight. Here's the complete listing of where we're going in this series. After we look at the social legacies of slavery, we'll be exploring the legal legacies with David Harris from the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute at the Harvard Law School. And after this webinar, we will be back in touch with you and let you know what readings Dr. Harris recommends that you do. The third in the series is about teaching Black Lives Matter. What is this movement? Where did it come from? What does it mean to people today? And what is it pushing for? So John Stauffer from Harvard will be kicking us off and kind of contextualizing the movement and its origins. And Hoyt Phillips from Teaching Tolerance at the Southern Poverty Law Center will be looking at how you actually teach it and curriculum that you can use in your classroom. If you have to miss one of the webinars live, all of them are being recorded and they'll be hosted on our YouTube channel. And after each webinar is over, we'll send you a link to that place, as well as a link to the chat box where those of you who are doing the series for 10 PDPs can post your comments and your thoughts about teaching applications, your takeaways really from what you've learned from each individual webinar. You should have all received emails from Stephanie DePoe about how to earn the PDPs, but it's basically just doing the readings, participating in the webinars, or if you need to, watching them after the fact, and then posting a paragraph describing your takeaways or an activity that the webinar inspired for your own teaching. So that's pretty much the logistical piece of our webinar. I really encourage you to post away and keep our discussion lively. And I am really pleased to have Marcia Chatelain from Georgetown University joining us tonight to inform us and enlighten us about the social legacies of slavery. I wanted to just mention a word about Primary Source in our work. I know that many of you know the organization well, but for those of you who are new, we focus our work on supporting teachers in cultivating global competency in kids, in cultivating cultural responsiveness and teaching in a culturally responsive way so that all of the kids in your classrooms hear and experience approaches that resonate with their own lives. And of course, building their skills that they're going to be using today and in their work of the future. So communication and creativity and collaboration and the like. We offer courses face-to-face and online, webinars like this one. We write curriculum and post some of it to our website for you. We also go out into your school districts and run customized workshops or consulting on different aspects of global education and inclusive education. So please let us know if we can support you in any way. We're really happy to work with schools over the long term and help you to build schools that look like globally and culturally responsive places. Now I'm so pleased to get to the content of our webinar and introduce Marcia, who is an Associate Professor of History and African American Studies at Georgetown. She has written a book called Southside Girls, Growing Up in the Great Migration, and she's currently working on a new one called From Sit-In to Drive-Through, Black America and Fast Food in an Age of Crisis. She is, in fact, on leave from Georgetown this year with support from a NEH a National Endowment for the Humanities Faculty Fellowship. So I'm really delighted that she's able to join us and take a break from her work on that to work with teachers. Marcia teaches about women and girls history. She teaches the history of Black capitalism. She speaks and writes extensively about issues facing African Americans in history and beyond. And later in the webinar, she'll share with you some of the particular work at Georgetown that she has been involved in. And lastly, I just wanted to note that Marcia's been a contributor to the podcast Undisclosed. She's the resident historian on the narrative about the 2015 killing of Freddie Gray by members of the Baltimore Police Department. So look for her in print and out loud, but tonight we have her here with us, and I'm so pleased to welcome Marcia to our webinar. Thanks for coming, Marcia.
Thank you, Deb. Can everyone hear me?
Yes,
okay,
I
great.
can hear you. Post in the chat box if you cannot.
All right. Well, it's a pleasure to be here today. I really value the opportunities that I have as a history professor to not only teach college students, but to also spend time with teachers in the K through 12 space to really help support them in the teaching of history and exploring new ideas for students so that they're excited when they come to my college classrooms about engaging with the material and really thinking about the way that a solid history education is really an education for leadership. In this particular political moment, I think it's interesting the number of times my students ask me, is this like this other moment in history? Is this like the 1960s? Is it like the 1970s? And what's exciting about that question is that students are increasingly looking to history to further understand their own analysis of the time that they live in and to think about who they will be in the future. And so it's a real pleasure to be here with so many teachers who are also excited about the teaching of history. Today I'm going to talk about the social legacies of slavery. And one of the things that is so important to me as a history educator is to help students make those linkages between the past and the present, as well as think about the ways that history forces us to grapple with this idea of change over time as well as continuity over time. And unfortunately, I think we are in a moment in which there's a lot of question as to how much progress or how much change has happened since the abolition of slavery in the 1860s, since the end of Jim Crow ostensibly in the 1960s, and most recently since the election of an African-American president. And so today I'm going to talk about some different ways we see the social legacies of slavery still play out in our current contemporary moment, and also point you to some resources that would be helpful in your own teaching about African-American history, as well as some of the struggles that have persisted over time. In August of 2017, I think many of us were riveted by images like this one from Charlottesville, Virginia, where a rally entitled Unite the Right brought together a contingent of mostly young men who had become radicalized online and in other spaces around this issue of white nationalism and white supremacy. They chose the Robert E. Lee Park in Charlottesville, Virginia as a meeting point to talk about their ideological commitment to an all-white nation, to express their feelings of anti-Semitism, as well as to, in many ways, amplify some of the symbols of the Confederacy. And in this particular moment, I think for many history educators, there are so many layers for us to examine with our students. What did it mean for symbols of the Confederacy to still be with us today? What did it mean for a new generation of young people to feel really compelled, not only by the ideology, but the symbolism? And what does it mean for us as a society when monuments are often used as a reference point to a history that is troubling or unsettling? And so when we think about in many ways how we started this school year, this is really a wonderful opportunity to think about the ways that we can teach with more depth and with more sensitivity about some of these issues in the past. And so I want to think about the ways that the legacies are all around us, that in the absence of a statue to the Confederacy, in the absence of an archive that looks at the history of slavery, in the absence of an African American History Museum, there is still a lot of presence in terms of the legacies from the 19th century. So I want to really briefly just walk us through a timeline of some key dates. And these are dates that are very familiar with you, but familiar to you. But I want us to think about the periodization. I want us to think about what it means when we think of a long history. So if we think about the period between 1863 and 1896, we have this 36-year period in which the nation is experiencing rapid changes and rapid positions around African Americans. And so you have the Declaration of the Emancipation Proclamation, which emancipates all, which emancipates slaves except those who are in border states. And then the end of the Civil War in 1865 and the full abolition of slavery that year. And then you have this 11-year period where people are being creative about what is possible in terms of African American rights. And if you think about the distance, for instance, between 2007 and 2018, we think about all of the things that have happened in that 11-year period. In many ways, Reconstruction was also incredibly revolutionary in that you started to see new programs and new ways of making African Americans full citizens. You see African Americans voting. You see African Americans getting married. You see African Americans trying to enter the labor force as free labor. They're trying to negotiate contracts with employers. They're electing to live away from their employers. They are reuniting with children and family members, and they're enjoying the everyday benefits and privileges of being a citizen. And when we think about the system of slavery, it was a system that was about enslaving not just the labor of a person, but their total person, making decisions about what religions they would belong to or not belong to, making decisions about what they would wear or not wear, making decisions about what they would eat or not eat, whether they would parent their own children or not. And so in many ways, when we think about this 11-year experimentation in freedom, it's about far more than just giving people the right to vote or opening schools so people could learn. It's also about a moment in which people are understanding themselves as a full self, fully articulated. And this is why when Reconstruction ends in 1877 with a series of political compromises, it is so devastating. And that moment prepares the space for the rise of racially restrictive laws like Jim Crow, and then the final moment in 1896 where we have Plessy versus Ferguson. Someone has entered the chat, and I really like the robust conversation. I feel like my middle and high school classes glossed the assassination of Lincoln throughout the turn of the 20th century and after a huge discussion of the Civil War. And so I think that this comment is raising this question about how Lincoln's assassination was also central to the reshaping of ideas about the nation and about whether a divided nation could maintain the peace. Thank you for raising that, Karen M. And so in this period of time that we go from the establishment of free people who had formerly been labor and been unfree to a period in which the Supreme Court says separate but equal is within the confines of the Constitution, this is the beginning of a period of time in which you start to see this incredible shift in how people can live out the possibilities of citizenship. And so when we think about that period of time, and then we think about the ways that we think about the civil rights movement, we have a period between 1896 and 1954 were separate but equal is the order of the day. And in that 58-year period is when we see the rise of legislation and policy and practices that will determine the next 60 years. So in many ways, we aren't just living with the aftermath of the Civil War. What we're living with is the aftermath of a period of time after the abolition of slavery, where so many policies are being made and the U.S. economy is rebuilding after World War II. And so when we look at the civil rights movement timeline, the way that we often lay it out for students, it's very important for them to understand how 1896 will shift the course of the country. And so those are some also important dates for us to think about. And so I'm going to continue on to some of the ways that we see this legacy. All right, so the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution states very clearly that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. And for students who are really learning the Constitution for the first time with any type of precision or attention, they look at this and they say, wait a second, it says except as a punishment for crime. And it really alerts them to the fact that the 13th Amendment is an incredibly complicated idea, that slavery is essentially considered against the Constitution except within the context of incarceration. And this understanding and this analysis of the 13th Amendment has been so central to the heightened awareness that has been raised in the past 10 to 15 years about what people call the prison industrial complex and questions about our criminal justice system. And so one of the ways that I think you can really illustrate the complicated legislative history and the complicated constitutional history and how it's animated today is to take students through a conversation about the 13th Amendment. And so when we look at one of the social legacies of slavery, we look at the disparities in sentencing and the disparities in the number of citizens of color that are currently incarcerated in the United States. African Americans are incarcerated in state prisons across the country at more than 5 times the rates of whites and at least 10 times the rate in 5 states. And this is from an organization called the Sentencing Project that tries to think about ways to reduce the number of people who are incarcerated in this country. We currently say that the estimates are about 2 million people who are incarcerated, and we have an overrepresentation of people of color. Now, if we think about the fact that slavery was abolished, but the conditions of servitude are allowed inside U.S. prisons, then it really raises this question about how the system of slavery helped shape the practices that are being used inside U.S. correctional facilities. There's some excellent books that I'll show you in a couple slides about the ways that after the abolition of slavery, there has been some really great ways of thinking about the continuity by looking at the prison and labor systems in the South. And so we have some questions in the chat. They're very good questions. Tasha raises the issue of the school-to-prison pipeline. And that is a term that is often used by justice advocates that are also thinking about the ways that failing educational systems that are under-resourced, that have a high concentration of students of color, how they often create a pathway into this system of incarceration that I'm talking about right now. We'll talk about educational disparities in a few moments. And so if we continue to think about these disparities, there's some excellent materials that you can bring into your classroom to help really illustrate this point. And so this is from the Pew Center on the States called 1 in 100 to look at the racial disparity in terms of 100 adults behind bars. What are the demographics of these different groups? As it stands right now, millennial women, so I think that's about the age range of about 20 to about 30, I think that's the range that they're saying, of color are some of the fastest growing populations that are being incarcerated. And so again, we see this different ways in which a system that was predicated on racialized injustice can be reproduced behind bars. And so if this is something that is interesting to you and you would like more resources, some of the material that you can incorporate in your classwork or some of the books that I highly recommend, of course the New Jim Crow has been massively influential in raising awareness about the prison industrial complex. The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness, by Michelle Alexander, who was an attorney with the American Civil Liberties Union, became very concerned about what she saw as a system that not only incarcerated people, but made them pay their debt even after they were released. And so this book looks at the many ways in which the justice system has failed and the way that the justice system has incarcerated people of color at incredibly high rates. And she talks about the conditions that surround it, from arrests to plea bargains to conditions inside prisons, and then the terms of parole for people who are recently released. Another book that really makes this linkage very clear is Slavery by Another Name, the Re-Enslavement of Black Americans from the Civil War to World War II. And Douglas Blackman is an incredible scholar who looks at the moment in 1865 where new legislation is being passed on the state level to basically put people in conditions that are incredibly similar to slavery. So he talks about chain gangs. He talks about incredibly high fines for low-level crimes that are then paid off by long jail sentences and terms. And that book is an excellent segue to the third book that I highly, highly recommend, Talitha LaFleurier's Chained in Silence, that looks at this issue from a gendered lens. And what she looks at in Black women and convict labor in the New South is the ways that the prison system, that arresting a critical mass of African-American men and women was central to the rebuilding of the South after the Civil War. And so the use of chain gangs and the use of forced labor was then used not only in private industries like the cotton industry in Georgia, but also for the building of railroads, which were essential for the rebuilding of the economy of the South. And so if you want to help your students understand the intricacies of political economy, of thinking about the ways that the incarceration system in the United States has not evolved very much in 150 years, and that some of the practices that were used after the end of slavery are used today. And so I highly recommend these resources. So when we think about that period of time between what's called the modern civil rights movement and Plessy versus Ferguson, some of the years that I like to highlight with my students include the period of time in which you see the mobilization of African Americans on a number of fronts. So the period between 1890 and 1920 is often referred to the nadir years, and that means the years of incredible crisis for African Americans, because at one end they are celebrating the freedoms that were granted after the end of slavery, but they're now contending with new threats. And one of those threats was lynching, the racialized violence that was used throughout the country to ensure that African Americans would not vote, would not agitate for their civil rights, would not gain economic and social power. And so during these years, organizations became so critical for the advocacy and encouragement and empowerment of African Americans. In many ways, I think students today are wondering if organizations are still important. I think that conversations about politics are a really good way to help our students understand organizations that are not necessarily political parties. And so many of these organizations in African American communities were helpful for things like advocating against lynching in the South, The NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, is founded in 1909 to advocate for African American civil rights. The Women's Era, 1890 to 1920, refers to the years where African American women were starting women's clubs on the local levels. Because of racial discrimination in the allocation of resources, these women's clubs took responsibility for local community projects, including juvenile justice, the building of schools and kindergartens, orphanages for abandoned children, homes for the elderly. They took on this work because they knew they could not rely on federal or state resources to provide for them. And one of the tragic ironies of this history that I think is important to point out is that in many of these years, African Americans are taxpayers, but they are not granted the rights of citizens. And when we think about the ways that we, Tasha asked a very good question that I'd like to respond to. Yes, many of these groups were made up of African American elites who had access to education, some connections to influential whites that they could broker deals. And so as a result of their elite status, there was work that they could do on behalf of communities, but there was often a disconnection, you're absolutely right, between the communities that they advocated for and the lives that they lived. In the Women's Club, it's kind of interesting because African American elites, even if they were among the few people who had the access to a college education, whether at institutions like Harvard, like W.E.B. Du Bois, or historically black colleges and universities like Howard University in Washington, D.C., or Spelman College or Morehouse College in Atlanta, even though they were members of an educational elite, a lot of them had financial challenges. And so if you look at the diaries of some of the women in the club women movement, they were working as domestic servants even as they were participating among this group of elites. And so their class position often distanced themselves from members of the race, absolutely, and they were also in a precarious position politically and economically because of their race or their race and their gender. That's a very good point. And so again, the building of movements becomes very critical in this period of time, not just because people had political interests that they wanted to indulge, but because they had to be strategic with limited resources. The other very important movement for some of the things that I'm going to talk about in a few minutes is the mass migration of African Americans from the South to the North. Starting at about 1917, after the conclusion of World War I, we see a massive movement of African Americans out of the Deep South to cities like New York City, with the establishment of African American Harlem, Chicago with the establishment of the South Side of Chicago. We see African Americans moving west to Los Angeles and then north up to Oakland. We see this mass migration of African Americans, and the urbanization of African Americans becomes an incredible legacy that we'll talk about in a second. Thank you for these excellent comments, folks. So when we think about education, we see the roots of the inequality that our country is still grappling with today in the period after the end of slavery. So the period of Reconstruction provided a lot of hope for African Americans because we had the training of African American teachers at historically black colleges and universities. We had the establishment on the local level of schools that children could attend for the first time, adults seeking opportunities to increase their literacy, as literacy was illegal for African Americans under the system of slavery. And so you start to see a deep desire to access education as a means of racial uplift. But again, there's no mechanism that's willing to fund this and support this. And so many African Americans, particularly in the South, were dependent on benefactors and philanthropies to build their schools. And so this photograph is of a Rosenwald school in Transylvania County, North Carolina. And Julius Rosenwald was the founder of Sears Roebuck. And for some of my students, they've never really heard of Sears, but as you know, the retailer was incredibly successful in the early 20th century. And so Julius Rosenwald was particularly concerned about African American education, and he built these Rosenwald schools throughout the South. Many of these schools were started by either interracial coalitions or incredibly wealthy whites who at many times actually were the heads of these schools as well. Many historically black colleges and universities didn't have African American leadership until about the 1950s or even the 1960s. And these schools were desperately needed and desperately under-resourced. And so you see these one-room schoolhouses that were educating kids at various levels. You had a real crisis where you had well-trained teachers, people with doctorates who were unable to secure positions, and many of them became elementary school educators because this was the most opportunity. But as the industrialization of the South continued and the modernization of the South continued into the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, you started to see a lack of African American high schools for African American children, and you started to see this incredible disparity between the modernization of high school education, particularly for white children versus black children. And so in 1954, people were particularly excited and hopeful that the decision made by the Supreme Court in Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas would change everything. And so when the court concluded that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place, that this might be a moment where true integration would happen. And one of the motivations for this integration was just the equalization of resources, that many states, in order to avoid desegregation, would create new school systems for all blacks. Often colleges and universities would pay for African Americans to attend colleges and universities in another state or send them to private schools that would take them rather than integrate their state institutions. This was a practice in states like Georgia and Mississippi. And so there was all of this resistance to integration, and there were hopes that once the Supreme Court said this is against the 14th Amendment, that things would change. But that change was met with deep resistance. And so I'm sure many of you have taught in your classes the response to Brown v. Board, like the crisis in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957. That picture on the top shows Elizabeth Eckford basically being bullied and mobbed as she tried to start the first day of school at Little Rock Central High School. You had all of this resistance to integrating schools, and when that resistance could not be mobilized just by the bullying crowds, school districts and communities used other strategies to keep schools from integrating. And so today what we see is that extensive research demonstrates that a child's social class is one of the most significant predictors, if not the single most significant predictor, of their educational success. And if we think about the racial disparities in race and social class, we know that we have school systems today that operate on this operate in this framework. The other thing is something to keep in mind is that one of the strategies that has been used by school districts that mirrors some of the strategies of the 1950s is secession from school districts. And so in the 1950s, people would mobilize mobs to try to intimidate African American children from integrating schools. Some places like Little Rock would just close the schools for an entire year. In 1958, the mayor of Little Rock declared all schools closed. You may be familiar with the counties in Virginia that closed their public schools for several years, up to 5 years, to prevent integration. And so families that had the access to private schools went to private schools. They found other accommodations for their children, and poor children just didn't go to school. And so one of the things that happened is that people started to form strategies that didn't require them to be bullies out in the street, but they used legislative tactics to keep schools integrated. And so what we see in this present moment is secession, creating new school districts, redrawing lines around school districts to maintain segregation. And if this is something that you would like to teach in your classes, two resources that I think are excellent are Eyes on the Prize interviews. If you Google it, you'll find it. Eyes on the Prize is a landmark documentary series that looks at the civil rights movement, and it was done by a director named Henry Hampton. And he has transcripts of interviews that didn't necessarily make it into the movies. And one of the episodes of this 14-part series is about the busing crisis in Boston, Massachusetts in the 1970s. And he has interviews from white students and black students who were at the center of this incredibly contentious busing plan. And I think that is an excellent resource to help humanize the experiences for your students and help them understand the very difficult choices that people were making in order to see if this experiment could work. The other thing that I would point you to is the National Park Service has a website called Teaching with Historic Places. Teaching with Historic Places has an entire web content series about the Rosenwald schools, many of which are National Historic Places, and you can look at maps of attempts to try to create African-American only schools in order to avoid integration. And so this is a really good way to do local history with your students and help them understand of how important it was, how important it is to use our historic sites and our federal institutions like the National Park Service, like the Smithsonian, as research resources. The next place I want us to go to is to look at this issue of African-American urbanization and the Great Migration. As someone who's written a book about the Great Migration, I am biased in thinking that this is probably the most fascinating period of time, because when you think about it, Jim Crow reign in the South after the end of slavery was all about restricting the movement and mobility of people. African Americans could not be wherever they wanted to be. Sometimes they had to have a pass that said that their employer was allowing them to be out after a certain time. We know that throughout the South and even in the Midwest and places north, there were sundown towns that indicated the time that African Americans and other people of color had to leave in order to be safe. We know that the rise of the Ku Klux Klan also made people very afraid to leave their homes. And with the segregation of public accommodations from pools to restaurants to libraries, African American mobility was rather constricted. And so when African Americans made the choice to pack up their things and try their fortunes in new cities in the North, it's an amazing thing to think about, moving your entire family and staking your hopes on a place that you have never seen, but you may have heard about from a friend or read about in the newspapers. African American newspapers like the Chicago Defender were critical in encouraging African Americans to move north for jobs and better opportunities. This map really shows us the different routes that African Americans took in their urban journey of the Great Migration, and a lot of these destinations were determined just by where the train routes went. And so if you are from Chicago, like I am, you know you meet many African Americans from Mississippi and Alabama. If you go to Los Angeles and you spend time with African American communities that have been in Los Angeles for a generation or two generations, you see strong ties to cities like Alexandria and New Orleans, Louisiana, and a kind of Cajun culture on the West Coast. And so these different migration maps allow us to understand the various ways that music and food and cultural life was very much shaped by the South. And so when people took this risk, when they went to the North, there were many reactions in the South, and some of the reactions were anti-migration, because although African Americans were living like second-class citizens, many people were concerned that if they left, their labor would go with them. And so some southern towns actually banned work recruiters from coming into the South to recruit workers. Some towns banned newspapers that encouraged migration, like the Chicago Defender newspaper, or made it illegal for people to actually move out of the state. And so you see these different legal mechanisms that are trying to keep African Americans from leaving, but the pull to leave was about more than just a better opportunity. It was about the promises that people could live with dignity. And I think that that's something that when you teach your students to think about the ways that for many of us, not all of us, that we don't really think about all of the everyday acts that we have that really emphasize our freedom. And so if we look at a city, for instance, like Chicago and the incredible boom of population, it also helps us walk our students through this conversation about how does a city absorb newcomers? What are the responses? What are the debates that form? What are the needs when people move to a new place? There's a little conversation about the New York Times best-selling book on African American migration in the chat room. I unfortunately did not write that book. I wish I did. But that book is called The Warmth of Other Suns. It's by an incredible writer, Isabel Wilkerson, and I highly recommend. And it's a book that is 600 pages long, and I can assign it to my freshman students. They read all of it, and then they share it with their parents. So it's an incredible book, and it has been so successful as a one-book program for various cities, and I know it will be a film soon enough. So you have all of these people coming from the South, and they're moving into the North for a better opportunity. But the reality is that racism was not something that was left behind in the South. Racism was something that existed in the North in different forms. And so there are more schools for African Americans in the North, but Southern children realize that they're not academically prepared to attend some of those schools because of the poor conditions of their schools in the South. There are many job opportunities in factories and slaughterhouses and different opportunities for women to work as domestic workers in homes in Chicago, and they are better compensated, but African Americans are repeatedly kept out of labor unions, and they're used as scab workers during strikes, and so they are targets of a lot of violence and a lot of hostility. Bombings were common practices that were used when African Americans would move into neighborhoods. And so as a result, this map shows us that African Americans then are concentrated in certain areas in the city. And this is the roots of hyper-segregation that we see in urban areas today and the hyper-segregation of public schools. And so this map, the shaded areas, are showing us the places where African Americans can actually get housing. Now, what's interesting is that they're getting the poorest housing at the highest rates, and they are concentrated in areas where they are targets of police brutality, they're targets of ethnic violence, there are race riots throughout these cities that have a growing African American population. And for many people in the South, who have traveled from their South, they're wondering if it was worth it. And so, in many ways, we think about this period of time as historians as fueling the kind of economic inequality that we see today. The New York Times reported this fall that Black families in America earn just $57.30 for every $100 in income earned by white families. And so when we think about that disparity, not just in income earning power, but then when we look at the ability to accumulate wealth and some of the mechanisms for wealth accumulation, including home ownership, which we'll talk about in a second, we start to see how this history of not only residential segregation, but also generational wealth, about the risks that people had to take to start over in new cities, the way that this permeates across generations. And so if this is something that you would like to teach in your class, there's some great resources about the urbanization of African Americans. Amistad Digital Resources from the Amistad Historical Library in New Orleans has an online feature called Plantation to Ghetto that looks at these years between 1919, which is a critical year for race riots in major cities, to 1953 to think about urbanization and what becomes known in terms of housing as the ghetto crisis in cities. The New York Public Library has an excellent digital collection on the Great Migration, and they also have digitized copies on that site, and other sites have them as well, called the Negro Motorist Green Book. And what the Green Book was just a listing of hotels and restaurants and gas stations that were welcoming to African American travelers, because it was so treacherous when people would travel throughout the South to different locations that they were afraid that they would be victims of violence or will be turned away in humiliation if they tried to patronize stores. And so there's some great projects with the Green Book. It is a state-by-state compilation of African-American owned and African-American friendly businesses. It was published, I think, up until the 1960s. I think it went that late. And you should check it out. And a great project with your students is to look at the locations in your own cities. And it's a great interactive project. So I'm going to talk about housing now. So when African Americans moved into these cities, one of the things that it did was it fundamentally changed the landscape of cities. And so you not only have hyper-segregation in some areas, but you also have the discrimination with lending in terms of purchasing homes. And people have talked a lot about redlining recently, and I know it was in that Case for Reparations article that I shared earlier, but some of these maps really highlight the ways in which segregation wasn't accidental. It was really fundamental to the planning of cities and suburbs. And I think redlining was particularly poignant for World War II veterans who had just fought for their freedom overseas and who had benefits to the federal government to purchase homes, and they would confront this kind of discrimination where banks did not lend to places in the red. They were cautious about the green, they're cautious about the yellow and enthusiastic about the green areas. And again, those were drawn along racial lines. And so what are the implications today? Well, if we look at the fact that housing discrimination in the rental market and the sales market is one of the hardest things to prove, but is a pervasive problem and overdetermines where people are able to find homes. In addition to that, because of redlining, there's a fundamental problem because people's home values, which was the basis of wealth for many generations in the United States, were also determined by where their home was. The third kind of part of this is the fact that because of the concentration of African Americans in certain neighborhoods, there became a problem of slums, and that's essentially overcrowding in housing that was not designed for so many people. And so when the Federal Highway Act was passed in the 1950s, and when the expansion of the suburbs by land developers that was supported by the banking industry and that was insured by the Federal Housing Administration rose, then slums were cleared to make space for highways, and they were replaced with public housing. And the reason why public housing became such a crisis after it was pitched as a remedy for overcrowding and for slum clearance was that public housing was originally set up so that the federal government would pay for the building of public housing, but they wouldn't pay for the maintenance. The maintenance had to come from rents and state resources. And so for those of you who are from large metropolitan areas that saw the decline of public housing in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, it was because it didn't have a financial infrastructure to support itself. And so we see a crisis in housing, affordable housing, wealth acquisition through home ownership, all coming together as one of the legacies of African American urbanization. If this is something that you'd like to teach about in your class, some of the resources that I like to use with my students, the University of Virginia's Weldon Cooper Center for Public Service has a racial dot map, and you can zoom in to even streets and highways, and each dot represents a different racial group, and you can see the racial dividing lines in your town. It's a really powerful way to get students to talk. Mapping Inequality is an online resource that you can look at redlining maps in different cities, and you can look at kind of how it played out over the 20th century. So I highly recommend those resources. So the thing that I want us to talk about next is voting. So one of the reasons why so many African Americans were excited about migrating to the North was the possibility that they could exercise the right to vote. voting rights are granted under the 15th Amendment, but the reality after the end of the Reconstruction period was the African American right to vote was not respected. African Americans were bullied from the polling place. They could lose their jobs if it was discovered that they registered to vote. They were often subject to violence if they tried to register. If you watched the film Selma, it's a fictionalization of a voting rights struggle in Selma, Alabama. And so one of the ways that we can talk to our students about some of the questions about this particular kind of political moment where people talk about voter apathy, or they talk about, you know, why people have this relationship to voting, I think it's important to understand how strange it is to imagine that African American voting was more robust after the end of slavery until up to 1877, and then there was a period of time between about 1877 and until the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, where African Americans, particularly in the South, did not see their right to vote respected. And you can engage them with some of these online resources. You can see literacy tests online that show how complicated it is to pass the test to vote. And so these are the barriers to voting that became commonplace until 1965 throughout the South. And they could be written by any kind of state official who had the capacity to do this. Congressman John Lewis, who was one of the great freedom fighters of the civil rights movement, and at Selma, he keeps a jar of jelly beans in his office because that used to be a voter test in the South. How many jelly beans are in this jar, to really amplify just how restrictive and ridiculous and painful voting blockages were. And so when we think about what are some of the legacies about voting rights, we see the issue of voter ID laws as a place in which people are concerned about the right to vote not being respected. And so in 2008, with the passage of various voter ID laws, and these laws keep on coming up on the state level, what does it mean to require an ID to elderly people who have a hard time accessing their birth certificates? What does it mean to require state ID? In Texas, this is a big issue, where there are fewer and fewer driver's licensing facilities or places to get IDs. And so this is a way in which people are starting to see some of the legacies about exclusionary voting practices today. And here is an illustration of how there's no kind of federal or national standardized way where people have access to the vote. And what does that mean in terms of participation in the democracy? And so some of the resources that I would point you to think about these issues are a book called Bending Toward Justice about the Voting Rights Act and how transformative it was. The Library of Congress has an excellent feature on civil rights history projects, and then a project through Wake Forest University called Wake the Vote was a series of student experiences around going to the different national conventions. Gosh, I could talk about this forever. We're almost at 8 o'clock, and so I am going to go very quickly. I apologize, but you have access to these slides as well to talk about healthcare, and then any questions you have for me, we'll start with questions because I want to make sure that we talk a little bit about the linkages of slavery in the healthcare system. So life expectancy is an issue that is often reported on, but I think we have to really think about the ways that generationally slavery's legacies is often seen not in just the economic and political and residential quality of life of African Americans, but their physical and health life, and how in many ways the lower life expectancy of African Americans is a bitter irony when we think about the fact that African Americans were often in the system of slavery used as experimental, I hate the word guinea pigs, but were used for experiments in medicine. J. Marion Sims is a very good example of this. He is considered the father of modern obstetrics and gynecology. And there were some contentions about a statue to him, a public memorial to him. And he used African American women's bodies to experiment in various ways. And so a lot of the medical knowledge that we have today, a lot of the things that we take for granted as common sense knowledge, whether it's about how the body works, whether it's various instruments that are used in surgery, whether it's our assumptions about the various health capacities of African Americans versus whites, all of this was innovated during the system of slavery. And so when we think about how that history continued into the early 20th century with the famed Tuskegee experiment, where the United States Public Health Service had given African American men syphilis just to see what would happen, even though we knew that penicillin was the #1 way to cure it. These experiments on African American bodies is so integral to the building of the U.S. healthcare system that these disparities, not only in experimentation, are then played out in access to healthcare, which is often linked to poverty, and then access to diseases that are environmental, which is often linked into quality of housing. And we start to see some of the reasons why we see this disparity in life expectancy according to race. And so if this is something that's interesting to you, 3 texts that I think are really helpful for understanding this are the very famous book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, which was adapted into a Showtime cable film starring Oprah Winfrey. Breathing Race into the Machine, and it talks about the spirometer and how our ideas about how much people can breathe are based on Civil War estimates comparing blacks and whites, and how that medical common sense lingered for almost 100 years. And then Medical Bondage, about J. Marion Sims and American gynecology, all bring home the point that we often think of the sciences and medicine as this kind of neutral space, but it's very much infused with the history of slavery and the history of race in America. And the last thing that I want to gesture towards is more personal. It's some recent work that I did at Georgetown University, and that was around Georgetown's working group on slavery, memory, and reconciliation. And essentially, I was part of a group of faculty and staff and students that looked at Georgetown's tie to the institution of slavery. And when people think about universities and slavery, they often think about whether or not slave labor built the buildings, or whether or not people who were involved in the slave trade donated monies to universities. But it goes deeper than that. Georgetown University owned slaves, and they owned slaves that worked on plantations in southern Maryland. And in 1838, they had a choice to make, and they made the choice to sell 272 men, women, and children from slavery in southern Maryland into slavery in the sugarcane fields in Louisiana. And as a result of that sale, they were able to retire some debts that the university had and continue expanding into the nationally known university it is today. And in this process, we had to be really reflective about how we share this history and how that history of slavery, how the history of Jim Crow, how the history of inequality also allowed the university to expand. And 2 things that we took away from the process that I want to think about, and I encourage you to read the stories and learn more about. We also have an online archive of some of the documents associated with the sale. The first one is that the sale of those 272 people wasn't the entirety of Georgetown's reliance on the system of slavery. Georgetown University students from the South were deeply tied to that system. And as a result of those various ties, we've been able to connect with some of the descendants of that 272. And we've been able to create a branch of a family tree for African Americans in a country in which sometimes that feels nearly impossible. So I'm incredibly proud that this exploration into our university's history became meaningful in the lives of people. And in this process, this picture of Frank Campbell emerged. And Frank Campbell's picture is the only photograph we have of a member of the 272. And this is so powerful, and it really highlights why history isn't just about learning about facts in the past. It's about improving the quality of people's lives and understanding their connections. And I've been incredibly grateful to be part of that process. And the last thing I will say about this project is that one of the things that we have to remember is that when universities or institutions, whether it's a nation, whether it's a college, whether it's a town, was invested in the system of slavery, they were also invested in ideologies about racial supremacy, about racial difference, and about justifying systems of inequality. And in many ways, it brings us back to this picture of what does it mean when we have ideas that are not only false, but so damaging about our past and about whether we've moved on from it, circulate. This is what happens. And so the work you do as history educators is so critical, and I'm so proud to have an opportunity to be part of this conversation. And so with that, I'm going to end my part. I'm going to turn on the video, and I'll take questions. Thank you.
Marcia, thank you so much. That was so illuminating and gave us, I think, enough to think about to fill maybe 3 webinars. I also appreciate all the comments and questions coming from our group, which have been amazing all through. So Marcia's on video. I'm going to deactivate my mic and let her kind of take questions as we go. So post them to the chat room or raise your hand. I also, while people are getting ready, I want to backtrack to one question that came up a little earlier in the webinar, which was about the Sentencing Project, and is it the same thing as the Innocence Project?
No, the Innocence Project is a project that's based on using cases in which there are DNA facts that have not been properly analyzed. And so when we look at the Innocence Projects that have multiplied since the establishment of their very first one, most of them are dealing with material evidence that has not been engaged. And so many law schools have Innocence Projects, and they're based on DNA. There is a move in the exoneration and criminal justice movement to try to find cases that are not as reliant on DNA because of various backlogs in the analysis of DNA. While DNA evidence is very strong and very helpful in seeking justice, there are times where it's not necessarily important for exoneration. The Sentencing Project is looking at the disparities around racial lines in the actual sentences that people receive and the plea bargaining system that can often put people in a difficult situation, particularly when they're innocent.
Great, thank you. Could you answer Lindsay's question? I wonder if Georgetown considered offering free tuition and board to the descendants of the Georgetown University 272?
Yes, so the issue of the 272, this has been raised. So if you are a descendant of the 272, you receive a legacy status as if your parents attended Georgetown. If you work at Georgetown, that's legacy status. The question about free tuition and board becomes complicated only because Georgetown, I believe in the late 90s or early 2000s, moved away from financial aid based on merit and went to a completely financial needs system. The problem with this system is that every decision about scholarships and aid is only made based on demonstrated need of a student. This is done to try to equalize opportunities to come to a school. So a wealthy family with a student who has perfect grades does not get a full ride to Georgetown. So a lot of schools have moved in this direction, and while it's a step for equality, it creates a huge problem for this situation. And so any type of scholarship that we establish for descendants of the 272 have to be done by a third party. An alumni association, a group in New Orleans could do it. A group of African-American alums could do it. A third-party foundation could raise monies to create a scholarship. And so I think that this issue particularly has required people to rethink these types of policies.
Great, thank you. Kayland asks, how did you begin having conversations with students about your school being formerly involved in slavery? I work at a private high/middle school that was formerly a slave estate.
You know, you just start the conversation. So I think in many ways this process is a Rorschach test. For those of us who are deeply engaged in this history, none of it's surprising. And for people who don't know this history, it's very surprising. But I think an education that's very steeped into what the U.S. was founded on and built on as it was expanding its institutions is the beginning, right? So if you understand slavery at the center of the building of a new nation, then you have a better understanding that every institution was part of that system. And I think it's important also because we are a Catholic institution, and as a religious institution, it's important to talk about the way that slavery was central to many religious groups and their practices and their expansion. One of the reasons why the Georgetown example is so powerful is because the Jesuits who facilitated the sale, they were actually advised not to do it by the Vatican. And there were many American Catholics who were very anti-slavery, and a lot of European Catholics that had already seen the abolition of slavery, and they were uncomfortable with the sale, but there were many people who supported it as well. And so I think the way you start this conversation is to talk about the city where you're located, you know, where the city stood in terms of the nation and the various neighborhoods in the capital, and say this institution is part of this as well. And you help people understand that you can go from a macro analysis to a micro one.
Great, that's a fantastic suggestion. I want to look at grade levels now, jumping from universities down to the 4th grade. Bridget writes, I teach a 4th grade reading curriculum about African American history from the 1600s to the present. One thing that the students grapple with is the human capacity for cruelty. How do you address the cruelty of white individuals and institutionalized racism with 9- and 10-year-olds? Any suggestions for her?
So some of the best resources about talking about race with kids, I think, are teachingchange.org, and dealing with kind of moments of crisis in terms of feelings. The American Psychological Association, I think, has some of the best resources for kids' books about trauma, about, here, let me move this camera, I look a little strange right now, about trauma and about grief and various emotional responses to this. Teaching for Tolerance is also good. One of the things that I like to help students think about is inequality in the ways that you understand it in 4th grade. So what are 5 things that you've witnessed at school or at home that you think are unfair? What are the things that you've seen people do when they don't want to take responsibility? How do you feel when you don't want to take responsibility? You really kind of distill it down to the ways in which they operate as people and the ways that they use their power, right? And say, so you know that feeling when you want to follow the rule, but you feel like something's unfair and you really kind of grapple with it, and you kind of talk them through that and say, okay, so those feelings are what sometimes motivates people to do really bad things. And how are some ways that people in this situation could have stood up to that unfairness? And so you don't distort the history to say, well, a lot of people thought this was bad and stood up, because the reality is a lot of people didn't. A lot of people did not join abolition, and a lot of people didn't join the civil rights movement. But you help them get into a speculative frame about knowing that people can do really bad things. What are some ways that we can think about being better when we are challenged by the cruelty of others, or we're challenged by, you know, a culture that says doing this is okay because it's legal even if we think it's wrong. So you help them kind of grapple with those kind of complications in their own life, and then you show them what happens when it's magnified and the incredible impact it can have.
Marcia, are you sure you've never taught 4th grade? That was brilliant.
Oh my gosh, I love, I spend a lot of time in K through 12 spaces, and I like teaching, 4th graders a lot more than college juniors, because 4th graders aren't worried about getting recommendations to law school, so they're more honest with you.
How about 5th? Heidi asks this question: how can I make a clear connection to my 5th graders about the reason behind the rise of Jim Crow laws, especially with the 11 good years preceding them? I try to teach it every year, but feel I don't have a good answer.
So you think about, I think teaching kids about backlash is so important. So you tell kids, basically, anything that you get, that anything that you have to preserve it, that it can always be kind of put at risk. So, people were able to really enjoy something, and then people who didn't like it found a different way to take it away. And that's, kind of a sad thing that's very real in life, but you have to understand that, that idea about kind of history as a wave is so important. And showing that wave and illustrating that wave, that people get something and then it's taken away. And so then they have to find different ways to get it back, and people might find a different way to take it away. And then you help them again with that speculative part about leadership and about substance. So what are some things that people need to do to help preserve the things that are important? How do you preserve the things that are important to you? How do we make sure we do this? And so I think all of this is very difficult, but I think that even in the 4th or 5th grade, we have to teach kids to not think of history as a complete progression of progress. I joke with my students that in their minds they think, the discovery of fire happens and then we get iPhones, and it just doesn't work like that.
I love that. This is hard in contexts where supporting about or teaching about African American history or literature does not feel supported. And so I'm drawn to Jessica Piper's comment about her experience in rural Missouri. We have teachers on this webinar from all around the country, not just in the Boston area. And her struggles to win the battle over states' rights in the Civil War are still really resonant. So I just wanted to draw attention to that comment and see if you have a thought about teaching in a somewhat hostile context.
Yeah, I think this is something that I get asked about a lot. In 2014, I started a Twitter campaign called #FergusonSyllabus, and I'm going to put it in the chat. And you can, if you have a Twitter account, or even if you don't, if you Google it, you can find various resources. And it's always really important for me to advise teachers to do things that are not only age appropriate, but climate appropriate for the school environment in which you work. And so if you are in a school where you'll not be supported about kind of telling the unvarnished truth, then you have to do it in ways that are digestible chunks. And that's why I really like the fact that we have so many digital resources. And so if your students are absorbed in a context where, they say, well, the Confederacy was just about states' rights, you may not be able to poke that bear. But it might mean to say, you know what, today when we talk about the Civil War, we're going to spend some time looking at some of the instruments that were used to shackle African Americans. We're going to go on the website of the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and we're going to look at some of those objects. We're going to think about what does it mean for a soldier who is fighting, on behalf of a country to then be shackled. Or we're going to think about what does it mean to not have enough food, or what does it mean for people to show up as refugees in refugee camps during the Civil War in places like Washington, D.C., and not sure if they have to go back into slavery. So some of the dimensions of that argument about this is just states' rights, it's no big deal, they're only able to stand because the atrocity of the system of slavery is often kind of glossed over. But there's a very kind of constructive way to say, well, we're going to engage with objects. you know, today we're not going to do so much reading, we're just going to look at stuff. And it's that stuff that I think can heighten the awareness. And that's why someone just talked about being a special education teacher and, you know, you have struggling readers. And so maybe, you know, text isn't the way to do it, but incredible photographs that show, you know, the backs of slaves, people who have these incredible whips on their back, and they're displaying it for a reason because they want the system to end. I think that at certain ages, you can expose students to that material very gently, not all of the pictures, but one or two, and say, these are the things that were really animating why people were so concerned about this system. And so the reframing through historical evidence, I think, is sometimes our most powerful tool in these environments where we might not be able to make the links between slavery and inequality as it exists today. But when we get to the depth of what it is, our students have the capacity to make those links themselves.
Marcia, you've been a wonderful teacher for us as well as a wonderful scholar, and I want to thank you for getting our minds really working and churning over some of these hard issues. And your suggestions have been excellent. And I think this first webinar has been a wonderful reminder of how social progress is not linear and that groups have constantly had to work for it and fight for it. So it really is a perfect start for our series and a very enlightening webinar in its own right. So we are out of time tonight, but I just want to say on behalf of all of us who are here, thank you so much and keep up the great work in teaching.
Thank you so much, folks. This was a lot of fun. If you have any questions for me, I'm always on Twitter, avoiding my grading. You can tweet me or you can send me a note through my website. It's just myname.com. Take care, folks.
Thank you so much, Marcia. Have a great night. Thanks, everyone, for joining. And if any of you are, good night. If any of you are interested in connecting with Primary Source in other ways, please visit our website, sign up for our newsletter, and follow us as well. And we will be back in touch with you before webinar number 2. Thank you so much. Good night.